Hey and welcome to this beginner's guide to React.js. In around an hour or so, I'm going to try and teach you all the basics of React so you can get up and running in your own projects. This guide has been updated for React 17 and is all based on hooks and functional components, if that's important to you. So let's get started. So what is React? React was created by Facebook in 2013 and it's a JavaScript library for building complex user interfaces. So yeah, it's a library, not a framework. React technically extends JavaScript and therefore it can be used as heavily in your application as you want. So you could just use it in a small widget or of course for the whole site if you'd like to. As I was saying, but although these days React does have a huge ecosystem around it, meaning React can essentially be a complete framework if you wanted to, if you used it with a build toolchain and an NPM and so on. But if this doesn't make any sense to you, it doesn't matter. React is not necessarily though for simple user interfaces due to its quite large overhead. A simple website with some interactive buttons and animations can easily be made with just vanilla JavaScript or plain JavaScript. So don't learn it for the hype. If you don't understand JavaScript already or you're new to web development, this is not the right place to start. You should definitely start with vanilla JavaScript, and any site that you can make in React, you should be able to also make with vanilla JavaScript. So over vanilla JavaScript, React has three main advantages, or three main power moves, I guess. These are the virtual DOM, JSX, and components. So virtual DOM, if you have a button on a page that you click and it changes some text, for example, or you have a counter, React only re-renders that individual part of the page. It doesn't re-render the whole page, which is a huge performance improvement, especially on large sites. Next is JSX. JSX is the way that you actually render the visual components on the screen, and it is almost identical in syntax to HTML, which for people who are very familiar with HTML, this is a massive reduction in the learning curve, and it's really, really nice to work with. And finally, components. React is built around components, which means you need to split your site up into loads of tiny different files. And for large sites, this hugely promotes reuse of code, and also allows large teams to be able to easily work on the site with little pain. And finally, it's incredibly popular, which is definitely a plus for some people. There's loads of available jobs and it has a huge ecosystem around it and community, which can really help for getting started. So of course, this is not for beginners. So what prerequisites wise, you really need to be familiar with JavaScript. JavaScript really is, it's an extension of it. It's for people who have outgrown JavaScript and are looking to advance their web development career. It's definitely not a starting point. Of course, HTML and CSS. CSS, technically not required, but HTML absolutely. A basic command line understanding would be a massive plus. We're going to be using Node and NPM in this, but I won't be going into it in detail. So as long as you're familiar with, you're familiar or have used Node once or twice before, or NPM, and you know things like CD, change directory, etc., then you're more than qualified. And of course, familiarity and use of a text editor. I use Visual Studio Code, it's my favorite, but of course, Sublime Text, anything like that. And finally, a modern web browser, so Chrome or Firefox is an absolute must. So let's get started with installation. How do you use React.js? So since it's a library, you could just use it with script tags. You can include a couple of script tags on your page and then use React via the React and React DOM globals directly in your HTML file, which is a really easy way to get started if you just want to play around with it. You can also use it via CodePen or something if you Google for that. But in this tutorial, we're using the most popular way of using React, which is create React app. You may have heard of this before, but it is a tool chain for React. So essentially, you will create a React app using a little command line snippet, and then what it'll do is it'll create a project with an entire file structure, which makes it really, really easy to just get started writing React code. And when you're finished, it has built-in scripts for building the final thing for production, and it will create minified HTML, CSS, and JavaScript files that you can upload to any static web server. So really, really awesome, and that's what we'll be using. So let's get started. Okay, so to install React, we need to use create React app, as we said. Now, in order to use create React app, we need to have Node.js installed, which you can check by running node-v. And if you get return with a version number, you have it successfully installed. If you don't have it installed, you can just head over to a web browser, search for Node.js, and download whichever the current version is. Then go back to your terminal and check it's all successfully installed. Alongside Node comes something called NPM, Node Package Manager, and NPX. Now NPM will let us install dependencies for our project. As you sort of get into React more, you'll maybe install Axios or some form builder or other plugins. But NPX is like a Node executioner that will let us actually install packages onto our system. And in this case, we want to install the Create React App sort of boilerplate, sort of build toolchain. And we can run this by using the NPX command. So before we do that, we want to navigate into our working directory. So in my case, I want to work in this folder called YouTube, which a little neat trick you can do on Mac is CD. And then I can actually just drag this folder and it'll change my directory. But however you need to do on your operating system, just move to the directory you want to work in. And now I'm going to run the command. So npx create-react-app is all you need to write. Create React App is the binary we want to install, and the npx, this is the command. And then the third argument here is the name of your project. So I'm going to call this one hello-world, and there we go. Press enter, and it's going to create a folder inside of YouTube called hello world, and add all of our Create React App boilerplate code in there. So I'll be back when this finishes. Okay, great. So it's also installed successfully. So the only other command we'll be using here in this tutorial, other than maybe installing packages, will be the npm command to actually run the development environment for this. So that is npm space start, and this will start up our development environment. Whoops, so I'm not in the correct directory here. So I actually need to move over first to my new hello world directory, which I'm going to do by cd hello-world. And now I'm inside my actual React project. So now I can run npm start, and that'll run one of the React scripts and open up in a web browser. And there we go. Here is our React application, all installed and working. Okay, so now that React is installed and running on your system, the next step is to open it in your code editor of choice. So in my case, I've opened the Hello World folder inside of Visual Studio Code, and now we're going to have a quick run through of what files have now been added. So you'll be able to see 3 folders and 4 files, hopefully, unless Create React App has been updated since you're watching this. And our main folders that we're concerned with is public and source. Most of these other items here are automatically generated and aren't really of concern, but we'll go through all of them anyway. So README, this has just got some basic information about some of the scripts and just some nice information that's published onto GitHub if you do put it on GitHub, and it may be nice to read through this to understand a little bit more about what Create React App does. Package.json, this is where all of your dependencies are described. So we'll see that right now our project depends on React and React DOM, and more will be added here in the future when you add more dependencies, maybe Axios or something else. Package.lock is for locking in versions. Gitignore is a GitHub specific file. If you're not familiar with Git, it doesn't matter. You can ignore this one. Our main concerns here are public and source. So inside the public file, there's a whole bunch of files in here, and you'll be familiar with these ones if you've obviously familiar with web development. So there's an index.html file here, and this is, well, essentially what the result will be once you've compiled all of your React code. So because React creates a single page application, i.e. JavaScript does all of the interactions, and there's only actually one HTML page. You will see here that there is some basic information here in the head, some meta tags and other things like this. There is some descriptions. All this is basic stuff. And then there's this here, div id root. Now this is important. When the React app is compiled, all of the code is inserted into this root, and then JavaScript handles everything that goes on inside here. So JavaScript will generate the HTML code to go into the root, and then the React app will all take place within here. The next folder we're concerned with in here is the source folder. So this is the main part of the folder structure here. This is where all of your React code will actually live. So the only two important files in here is actually index.js and app.js. The rest of these, some of these are actually completely unnecessary, or they're a little bit out of the scope and you probably will not use them for a long time. For example, testing, web vitals, this is a new feature. The logo, this is actually the logo that is displayed here. So much of this will actually be deleted as you write your own code. So what I'll do is I'm actually going to ignore all of these, and in the next section we're actually going to delete all of this stuff and just keep some of the main parts here, index and app. So index.js first. So this file will actually be pretty much untouched. So what it does is it uses React DOM to take the app, this means all of the React code, the app file here, which we'll see in a second, and insert it into that root div element that we saw in index.html. That's all this does. So React DOM is basically the way that React code is transferred into the DOM. And that's why there is one individual file for this. And then all we have to do is include our app component. This is actually a component, which is this file, and then this function will put this into our root element for us. And therefore we can actually pretty much ignore this file. Where all the real stuff happens is in app.js. Now app.js is where you'll start to see where things are falling together here. This is the user interface that we see here with our rotating image and edit and save to reload here. This is all this, and as you can see, this looks almost identical to HTML, but this is actually JSX, as I mentioned in the slides. And this is where we're actually displaying our user interface. We'll get into all of this in the next section. Okay, so rendering in JSX. So this section right here, as we explored in the last section, is actually JSX and not HTML. So while it does look and act almost identical to HTML, there are a couple of noticeable differences. So class name up here, in HTML this would just be class. For example, if you wanted to add the class name of app for your CSS. But because class is a reserved keyword in JavaScript, we use class name using the camel case syntax here. But the cool thing, of course, about JSX is because it's JavaScript, we can write JavaScript just directly in here. So for example, let's say up here in this is our JavaScript function. Let's say we have a variable called name, and I'm going to put my name in there, James. Now this here in HTML, it'd be difficult to put this variable in here. We'd have to, identify by an ID and then insert it into the inner HTML. But it's simple here. So all we need to do is add two curly brackets to say we're going to write a JavaScript expression, and then we can just write JavaScript. So I'm going to write name, and that's literally it. If we go back to our web browser here, we'll actually be able to see that it's automatically reloaded for us, and I've got my name appearing up here. And I mean, much of the other things you could change in here would act as you would expect. So let's say I delete all of this and wrap this name in h1 tags, like so. Just like in HTML, this is acted exactly as we expect it to. Since you can add curly brackets and therefore write JavaScript code anywhere inside of JSX, this would also work for attributes, which in React are actually called props. So for example, if we had a class name that we wanted to add to this h1, but we wanted it to be dynamic for whatever reason, what we could do is we could add the class, and of course we're calling it class name, and then equals, and then curly brackets, of course, because we want to add some JavaScript code. And then we can just reference the variable, as you would expect. And now this h1 will have the dynamic class name of my variable. So if we go back to our web browser, open up DevTools, take a look at our inspector here, and I'm just going to have a look, we'll see that our h1 here has the class of James, and it's working perfectly. So that's your sort of rundown of JSX, and we'll certainly get more into JSX into the next sections as we look at components and so on. Okay, next is components. So components are one of the most important parts of React, and they are used for splitting up your user interface into smaller chunks that can be reused and also easily worked on by other people if you decide to grow a team in the future. There are two main types of components in React. These are called functional components and class-based components. Now this tutorial is for React 17, and I personally no longer use class-based components at all, since everything now can be achieved with functional components. So this won't make any sense to you if you're new to React, so you can just ignore this, but if you are familiar with older versions of React, I will not be covering class-based functions. Now the function you see here is a functional component, is what it's called, and it is created simply by declaring a JavaScript function, in this case it's called app, and then returning something, and that return needs to be JSX. So in this example, that HTML looking syntax right here. And that creates a React component. That is what a React component is. Before we continue, what I'm going to do is I'm going to clean up a little bit. The Create React App boilerplate has added quite a lot of stuff and extra code that I'm going to remove to avoid any confusion. So first I'm going to delete this logo up here and save that. And then I'm going to go to index.js and remove some stuff. So we don't need report web vitals, and therefore don't need this import here. And we can therefore also delete a bunch of extra files here. So I'm going to delete app.test.js, logo.svg, report web vitals.js, and setup tests. I'm going to go ahead and just delete all of those. Now if we save this and refresh, we should still have a nice working page where we can continue from. So a component. This here is a component, and let's actually create a new component. So let's say we have our header here with a name in it, and I'm going to just create a paragraph here and add some text. Welcome to my blog. So now we have James and welcome to my blog. Now I want to split this user interface up and make this James title into a new component, so I can say reuse it on other pages or include it multiple times on this page. So it's simple enough to do. I'm going to create a new file in my source folder here, and I'm going to call it header.js. As simple as that. And then inside of here, I'm just going to create a JavaScript function. So function, and then because this is a component, you'll notice how I've given it a capital H in the file name up here, and I'm going to do the exact same here in the function. So it has to be a capital letter, like this. If you want to do 2 words, you would have to capitalize both words, for example, like this. But I'm just going to call mine header, so I'm going to leave it like that. And then, of course, because it's a function, I'm going to have 2 brackets, and then my curly brackets here. Now, as I said, to make it a React component, we have to return some JSX. So I'm going to return, and then I'm going to add some my h1 tags like I had before, and I'm just going to say James, like that. Now, we're almost done. What I'm going to do here is I just need to export this function, export default header, and that's it. That means we have created our function and we export it as the default function. And that means that when it's imported into app here, React is going to know that it is a function. Now again, if you're coming from older versions of React, or if you're not using Create React App, you'll actually have to import React up here in order for it to recognize that it's a React component by doing import React from React. As simple as that. However, if you're using Create React App, in React 17, this has been made automatic now. It'll automatically import the parts of React that you're using. So we don't need to actually include that at all if we're doing a basic component that just displays some text here. So back in our app, what I want to do now is I want to actually use this component and show it inside of my main app component here. So of course I want to replace my h1 here. So I'm going to remove that. And I'm going to go ahead and reference it here. And the syntax for doing this is like a HTML tag. So I'm going to open up my less than sign, write capital H for the component name, header, and then make it self-closing. So that's a / and a more than sign to look exactly like this. Now, this is underlined. It's underlined because, as it says here, header is not defined. This plugin here is called ESLint, by the way, if you're interested. You don't need this, but it will certainly help as you get more into React. So we need to import it in order to use it. So we want to import capital H header, the component name. Of course, we want to make it available here. And then we want to put from, so we can say what file header is located in. And then we just need to include a reference to it. So we're in the same directory, and it's called header.js. So we have to do / for the same directory. You always have to do this. If you don't do this, React will be confused in terms of the path. So this means current directory. And then capital H for header. Now it's a JS file, but because we're in a JS file already, we don't need to put JS on here. This is redundant. React will recognize that it's going to be a JS file and automatically place it there. So we can save that and go back to our web browser and just hard refresh, and we'll see that it is working just as before. So there we go. We've imported another component into our file. Now, here's something interesting. So in our app.js file here, we have this variable name. And let's say that we have to store it here. We can't store it in the header file because we use it multiple times on this page, and we get it from a database, for example. We can't just write it in here statically like this. So what we need to do is we need to pass in information to this header component. So the way we do this is through something called props, which looks like a HTML attribute. So just like you would declare a HTML attribute, you can put in the name of the prop, that whatever you want to call it. So I of course want to call it the same as the variable name here. So I'm going to call it name. Or in fact, no, I'll call it title, so you can see the difference here. So I'm going to call the prop title. And then I want to pass data into the title prop that I'm sending to header, which is going to be, of course, this variable name. So I'm going to copy that, open up my equals here, and then, of course, we're writing a JavaScript variable. So it's going to have to be curly brackets for that JavaScript statement that I explained earlier. Paste in name, and there we go. We've passed in a prop called title and made it equal to the variable name. Now, if we go into our header, how do we receive this? Whenever you have a component like this, inside of these brackets here, these parentheses, there's always the variable props available. This could be an empty object, but in this case, because we have passed a prop, it's actually available. That means that the props available on it are keys within that object. So as you would if you were displaying a variable, we want to open up our curly brackets to write a JavaScript statement. And then we want to do props, and then access the name key on the props object. So that's going to be props.name. Or sorry, actually it's props.title, because we called the prop title, even though the variable we passed in is name. This prop name right here is what you're actually receiving. That's really important. So I'm going to save that and go back, and as you can see, we're still seeing the same thing, which is working perfectly. We're seeing our information through there. And that's essentially it. That is components and props. We're going to see much more components as we get through and into the example near the end, but that is the sort of basics of components and props. Okay, so component state. Now, component state is the coolest part of React. This is why you would actually use it over just vanilla JavaScript. All the component stuff that we've done so far, this is all kind of possible in JavaScript and quite easy to do. State is essentially a variable that React listens to, or JSX listens to. That's sort of the best explanation for it without getting too technical. It's going to be a variable that the user interface, or JSX, is going to listen to changes and display those changes. So let me kind of give an example here. Let's say that we have this name called James. Now what I'm actually going to do is I'm actually going to make it like a login system. So I'm going to say guest here. So if we refresh that and go to here, we'll see it says guest. Now I'm going to add a button down here. So this is just a normal HTML button, and I'm going to say log in, just like that. Now here's where we're actually going to start learning about some JavaScript event handlers as well, and how they work in React. But as you would in normal JavaScript, you'd use an onClick here. OnClick in JSX is onClick but with a capital C, like that. Simple as that. And then I'm actually just going to reference a function here. So I'm going to make a event function here, as you normally would in JavaScript, and I'm going to say it is function login, just like that. and I'm going to reference it by doing just login. You don't want to put brackets on the end of here because that means it would run automatically. If you don't put brackets on the end, then this will only run when the onClick handler is actually clicked, and it won't automatically run. That wouldn't be good. So that's very simple. Now inside of our login event handler here, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to change the value of that variable. So I'm going to set it name equal to James to simulate a sort of login event there. Now, of course, a const is not correct because I'm changing it. I'm going to change that to a let. And there we go. This would be, you know, what you would expect to work, right? But if we go over to Firefox here, click the login, nothing actually happens. And this is where state comes to the rescue. So state is essentially going to be, we're going to change this variable of name to a actual piece of state. And what's going to happen is the user interface over here is going to listen for that change, and it's actually going to automatically update it when we click on the login button. So let's do that. How do we convert this to a piece of state? Well, it's actually really, really simple. So there is something in React called a hook, and one of those hooks is called use state. It lets you hook into React, use features from React, if that makes sense. So what we need to do is first of all import that. So it is a named export from React. It doesn't really matter if you don't know what that means, but that means that you have to put curly brackets here in the first argument of the import, and it's called use state, just like that. Curly brackets and then use state. And that is from the React library. Super simple. Now we can write the actual state syntax. So state syntax looks like this. It's a constant variable, and then you need to put 2 square brackets like this, and then these square brackets, it takes 2 arguments, a getter and a setter for this piece of state. So the getter for me is just going to call it name. I just want to be able to reference it by name like I already have. And then I need to create a setter. Now the setter is actually a function, which is quite cool. So in order to update this piece of state, update this variable that we're storing, we're actually going to run a function to do that. So we can call this function whatever we want. The general naming convention here is just like set and then the variable. So set name in a camel case like that. And then we set that equal to this use state hook up here. Use state. And this hook here is an actual function, of course. We're running a function in order to assign these. Now, what goes inside of this function call here? What goes inside here is actually the default value of the state. So far we've made a getter and a setter for the state, but we haven't actually given it a default value. So it would actually just be, you know, undefined. In order to give it a default value, this default value could be anything, you know, an object, an array, a string. In this case, a string. So I'm going to call it guest, which works, right? So what else do we have to do here to make this work? So name and all this will actually already work, right? Because our getter is called name like our old variable was. Great, it actually still works. But login doesn't. As you can see, it crashes. So, well, you may guess, we're going to run this set name setter. So instead of name equals James, we're going to run set name. And of course, it's a function. What do we put in the function? Just the new value. So, James. And there we go. We've run the setter, and we have obviously, we're passing name here into our header and so on, but we're using the getter and the setter. And if we save that and go back over here, press login, there we go. Our user interface listens to that change and actually changes it to James. And, as I explained with the virtual DOM earlier, the page only re-rendered that singular word. The whole page didn't actually re-render, which, if this was a very complex site, would be a huge efficiency improvement. So, that's state. Alright, component lifecycle. So component lifecycle is referring to the stages which the component takes in its sort of life and death, as you could say. So it's mounting onto the DOM, and then it's mounting off the DOM eventually when you're finished with it. So when we talk about lifecycle, we're talking about lifecycle methods, because we'll often want to run code when the component initially mounts onto the DOM. This is sort of the main use case here. Now, that probably doesn't make any sense. So let's sort of put this into an example where you could see why lifecycle methods would ever be used, or why you would want to use them. So of course we're making a blog here as our example has sort of come to be. So our blog would need posts, right? We would need to have a list of posts in our blog. Now, if you were doing this, making your own blog, you would have a database, and therefore you'd display things from a database, maybe from an API. But in this simple example, we're just going to use something called JSON placeholder, which is essentially a fake API that we can use to, well, in this case, display how React can work. Now, when our component mounts here, what we want to do is we're going to want to make an API request, aren't we? Because we can't make an API request until the component has actually mounted onto the page. But we do want that API request to happen immediately as soon as the component is mounted, and we only want it to actually happen once. So what we're going to do is we're going to use the useEffect hook, which runs code when the component mounts onto the screen. Now, how do we do this? Let's first of all import it. So just like we imported useState, let's import useEffect. And to use it, we actually have to run a function inside of our actual component here. So where I place my useEffect hooks are underneath my state. So I put my state up here, then I run my effect hooks, and then I run my normal functions just here. So let's do it. useEffect. And useEffect, of course, is a function, but it takes two parameters. It takes the actual effect callback, the code you want to run as part of the component mounting, for example. And the second is a dependency list. So why a dependency list? What does that mean? A dependency list is where the function is going to run as part of a dependency or as a reaction to dependencies. So useEffect hooks can be used for more than just when the component mounts. The code can actually rerun when a piece of state that it relies on changes. So an example could be, let's first of all put a function in here as our first parameter. So our function is going to just run console log hello world, like that. And then our second parameter here is going to be our dependency list. Now this is an array, of course, it's a list of dependencies. And if we display no dependencies here, this just means run once, run when the component mounts, and never run again. So if we save that, go to Firefox, and have a look, we'll see that it ran once when the component mounted, and it's not going to run again. So this is a perfect use case for our API fetch, where we want to fetch posts. We can just run our fetch in here, and then we can store that in a state, for example. But what useEffect can also do is it can also rerun if a dependency changes. So what's that? So if you had hello world and I want to say hello plus append on name from our state here, we'll see that this is actually underlined, which means it's missing the dependency of name. For example, if I didn't do it, it would just run once for hello guest. And in some situations, it can actually cause huge problems and memory leaks. In this situation, it's very simple, but you would have to make sure you add the dependency of name. And this is so, of course, it would run whenever the name changes. Now, of course, it doesn't actually change until we press the button, but if we did press the button, it would actually run that useEffect hook again and update it with that new name. So useEffect hooks can be used for more than just when the component mounts, but that is the only situation we'll be using it in this example. So let's remove that, go back to hello world, and let's go ahead and make our API request. So if we go over to JSON placeholder over here, there's a little bit of snippet here for using the JavaScript fetch API. It's a really, really simple function. I'm not going to be going into it, and I'm actually just going to be stealing this code anyway. And let's paste it in place of this console log. Now, this example is taking to-dos. I don't want to do that. I want to take posts. This is essentially a list of fake posts. I think they're lorem ipsum or something. All this does is convert it to JSON and then eventually console log the result. Let's go ahead and actually see that, because I want to see what we get. There we go. So if we look here, we get an array of 100, and we actually see all of our different posts here. And each post is an object containing a body, an ID, a title, a user ID. For this example, we're going to keep it really simple, and we're just going to output the title. We're essentially going to make a list here on the page. So, well, first of all, what we're going to have to do here, so we're going to have to store this somewhere. Now let's store it in state, as we did with our name. So let's create another identical piece of state called posts, because that would be a logical name for it. And then let's create a setter for that, set posts. And let's, of course, use the state hook. And what's our default going to be? Well, it comes in as an array, and we don't have any posts, of course, when the component initially mounts, so it's just going to be an empty array. Now, it's really important that it's an empty array, of course, because what we're going to do is we're going to output this list onto the screen. And when it originally mounts, we would want that list to be empty, and then we could maybe check if the list is empty and say loading or something like that. And then eventually, when the API request is finished, it's going to update the state, and then the screen is going to automatically update with all that list of posts. So we can see here how state and effect hooks work together to create this really awesome and really clean solution for managing component lifecycle here. So let's do this. Let's set posts with that incoming JSON data. And there we go. That should work, but we'll obviously not be able to see that until we have actually rendered out our posts onto the page. So let's do that as the final thing. Down here, what we'd want to make is a simple list of items. So let's just make an unordered list like that. And then how would we create how would we automatically render how would we automatically render an array onto the page? Now in JavaScript, the modern JavaScript, we of course have the map function, which this is one of the reasons why you need to be experienced with JavaScript or have some experience with JavaScript before doing this tutorial, because map can be a little bit complicated to understand, but I will do it here anyway. So posts.map, and as a quick explanation of what map does is essentially it is a function and it has a callback within it, and the callback runs for each item in the array. So I'm going to use an arrow function here, which has an automatic return on it, and therefore I'm going to write post, because this callback runs for each item, so therefore it would call back an individual post for each loop, or each item in the array, sorry. And what we want to do is we want to return JSX, right? And this is where JSX becomes really cool, because it's just JavaScript, we can actually just directly return JSX. So of course an arrow function in one line is an automatic return, and we can just output JSX directly there, which is really, really cool. Now, because we've gone back into JSX again here, what we'll then need to do is we'll have to add curly brackets again to say, well, we're in JSX here, but we want to go back into JavaScript to output our variable. Now we know that post is an object because we saw that in Firefox, an object, but it has 4 keys on it. We just want title, so we're going to do post.title, just like that. Again, if you're not familiar with map, have a look at the JavaScript documentation and it should make sense. But that's all we're doing, is we're just looping through posts and outputting a list item for each item in the array. And of course, we'll be using this use effect hook to automatically update that list once the fetch call has completed. So let's take a look at it in action. There we go. If we actually refresh here, you'll be able to see a split second where there's actually no items in the list. But there we go. That looks pretty good. So you'll notice in the console there is just one little error here, and this is to do with React and how it works with the map function. So whenever you map out an array here and you're creating multiple different list items, multiple different DOM elements, React wants you to identify each one just in case one individual one updates. It doesn't want to over re-render the page or create any glitches. So all you need to do to fix this is add a key onto the element that's being duplicated and give it something unique. And most APIs will obviously have an ID for each post. So let's go ahead and do post.id. And if we refresh that, we won't see any visual change, but we will see the error has gone because we have solved that small problem. But there we go. We're rendering out a list of blog posts, and we're using the useEffect hook to run that API request when the page loads. Now this section is titled Event Handling, but if you're keen-eyed, you'll actually notice that we already covered event handling when we did the login button. However, in React, event handling can be a little bit more nuanced. There are some scenarios that can create bugs, and since this is a sort of full beginner's guide, and you should be able to get started building your own applications, you're going to quickly run into problems, since event handling is a very core part of React. The first example where this is quite a nuanced issue is, for example, if we want to pass in a parameter to login. So let's say name is not statically written here, and name actually comes from a parameter on login of first name, and is therefore passed into name. Now, if we wanted to supply this parameter inside of our onClick here, we would have to open our parentheses and type in whatever the parameter is. But you're going to, of course, realize there's a problem. As I explained last time, if you provide parentheses, this will cause login to automatically run, which of course is a huge problem. Let's show that. Let's save, go to Firefox, and we're going to get too many re-renders. It's infinitely rendering. It ran automatically and it's going to keep running. So what we need to do is we need to force it to only run when onClick is ran. And we can do this by what's called binding it. And to bind it, all we have to do is run it within a arrow function. Now, an arrow function is just a simple JavaScript function with a different syntax. And all we have to do here is provide two parentheses and then an arrow, equals and a more than. And of course, on one line, just like our map here, it automatically returns. So we're just going to put login there. And that's all you need to do. Of course, this also allows you to grab the event, which is really cool. Whenever you click, there is an event automatically provided to you, which you can grab by getting E here, which is super useful. So if you wanted to prevent a default action from happening in JavaScript or something else you wanted to get, the input from a text field, for example, you can get the E by doing this, and then of course pass it to your function if you wanted to. But in this scenario, we're just going to see how the arrow function fixes our problem. And it does, as you can see. If we refresh, login works as before, and it only runs when onClick is clicked, which is absolutely perfect. Furthermore, through use of the arrow function here, we could of course return not just an automatic return, but we could return a block of code here to run inside this function. And therefore we could actually run login more than once, or we could run a different function here. Say, a console log, just like that. And this is another really useful reason for using a arrow function here. If I say refresh here, login, button clicked, we've run two functions at the same time. Let's do one more example just for good measure. So let's say we want to add a new post to the top of our posts list, and we want to have a button to do that. Let's create that. So a button, and it's going to add new post. And of course, we're going to have an onClick handler, which we're going to open up to our JavaScript expression, and we're going to want to run our function. Now this function is not going to have any parameters, so we don't need to run it inside of an arrow function. We can just call it directly. The function is going to be called onAddPost. Let's create that function. Function onAddPost, just like that. Now, of course, we have two parts of onAddPost. We're going to have to construct our new posts array. All we're going to do is add a new post onto the front of it, and then keep all of the other items in the array intact. And then, of course, we need to update our state so that our user interface will update as part of it. So you can kind of see how all of the parts of React are working together here. So let's construct our new array. We're going to be using some ES6 trickery to do this, some JavaScript ES6 trickery. Again, if you're not familiar with this stuff, have a look at the documentation and it should explain it. So I'm going to create my new posts array. So I'm going to call it new posts array. And I'm going to create a new array, so my square brackets. And I'm going to add my first object. This is going to be the new item I'm adding. So it's going to have an ID of 99 or 999. And then add a title. Title is going to be my new post. And to add all of the other items back onto the end of this array, we're going to use the JavaScript spread operator, which means I'm going to reference the existing posts array, and just do 3 dots on the front to spread it out and essentially insert all of those items to the end of my array, just like that. Now, the only thing missing is to update my state with this new array that I've created, which I'm going to do via set posts, and just provide my new posts array. As simple as that. That's all that's needed. So I'm going to go back over to Firefox here, press add new post, and there we go. We've added a new post. It's really as simple as that. So you can kind of see if you're creating a blog here, you could have a form and some text and so on. I'm actually going to look at forms in the next section, and you'd be able to press add new post and quickly update the interface. React is really, really nice to work with. Alright, so forms. This is going to be the last major section of this tutorial, and we're going to explore how we can interact with form elements, like in our case the input box, as well as submitting forms, and we're also going to explore a bit more about props, because this scenario is actually going to pose a couple of different problems. So let's get started. So what we're going to do here, the primary thing that we're going to do, is we're going to change this add new post button to an input box and an add new post button. And what you can do is you can specify any post title in here, and we can add it to the top of the list. So some of this functionality we'd actually already done. So in our onAddPost function here, we'd already created most of that functionality. The only real thing we're doing here is this title needs to be dynamic based on some input from a text box. And also, it's getting quite complicated, this app.js. There's too much going on in here. Of course, React is all about splitting your code up into components. So what we need to do is we need to create a new component for this first. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's go to our source. Let's add a new file, and let's call it addPost.js. And let's create our component in here. So of course, like any other component, we'd create a function here, and we're going to call it addPost. Now, just as we called the file name, notice the capital A, capital P, really, really important to capitalize your components. You can't go with camel case here, that's not valid. And of course, some parentheses there. Open up our function, and we need to return some JSX in order to make it a React component. So let's return some paragraph and just say add new post form, something basic. And of course, before we forget, we need to export that as the default function so that React knows what to do with it. So all done. So let's go ahead and import this into here. So as we did with our header, we're going to import from, and then we have an autocomplete here. Don't forget to set the current directory, dot and /, and then we're going to reference it in our user interface. Now I'm going to replace this button with it. I'll create some space here. So we're just going to do add post and self close it like that. Really nice. So let's go to our Firefox over here, and there we go. Add new post form. What's our next step? Well, let's go ahead and first of all steal this function. It's no longer needed in the parent here in app.js, but instead it's going to be needed here inside of add post. This is going to be when we submit our form. Well, and speaking of that, well, let's create our form. So instead of paragraph tags, we're going to create form tags, just like that. And inside of our form tags, we're going to have 2 elements. So these 2 elements are going to be an input, and let's give that a type of text, and let's give it an ID as well. Let's give it an ID of post title. And let's go ahead and self-close that. And of course, we're going to need a button to submit our form. So let's create a button, give it a type of submit, and then we'll just we call it, add post, something like that. Great. So if we go ahead, and I'm actually just going to comment this out. This is going to cause an error because set posts doesn't exist. And there we go. As you can see, we have a text box and an add post button, and when we click the add post, it actually refreshes the page, because whenever you submit a form, it actually automatically refreshes because it expects a URL to go to. So, well, let's start tying this together then. So a form, of course, has got a event handler on it, and that's called onSubmit. So kind of like a button has onClick, a form has onSubmit. In normal HTML, this would be on submit or lowercase, but in JSX, as the styling goes, it's a capital S on submit, just like that. And of course we can set that equal to an event here, and we're not going to have any parameters on our function here on add post, so we can just reference on add post directly, like that. If this had any parameters on it, we would have to reference it inside of arrow functions like this, but in our case we don't. So on add post. Now whenever you have an event, whenever you have a function and event handle like this, there's always the event available as the first parameter, even if you don't have any parameters. I'm going to abbreviate this to E, and just like you would in vanilla JavaScript, you can use that E to prevent the actual default redirect that we just saw. E prevent default, just like that. Now it's really cool, we can actually test that our form no longer redirects. Add post, does nothing. Press enter in here, does nothing. Perfect. So what are we going to want to do here? Well, we're actually going to want to somehow record the value of what's in here, because let's say we want to form our new post array right here. This title is going to be dynamic. Where do we get this from? So in React, whenever you have a form element, so let's say like an input, what we want to do is we want to record the value of that input in the state. And whenever it changes, whenever you type a new character or delete a character, we want to update that state. And this is actually really easy to do. So we use two props on the input element here, which are value and onChange. Now onChange, this is another event. So we've now learnt three events: on submit, on change, on click. On change is whenever the input value changes. And just like any other change, we get a E event on there. So as you can probably tell here, these perfectly align up to something we just learnt about. Value, that's a getter. On change, that's going to be a setter. So we can align this up to state. Let's create a piece of state for it. So const, a getter and setter. So let's call it post title and set post title, the getter and setter for our state, and set that equal to use state. And by default, we want it to be an empty piece of text. So let's just give it an empty string as a default value. Now, of course, we need to actually get use state. So we're going to have to import it from the React library. Import use state. Don't forget the curly brackets. It is a named export from React, just like that. And then what we can do now we've all done this is we can put our getter into the value. Now, with our onChange, we can't, of course, just put in set post title in here. Like, well, that's just going to do nothing, right? What does onChange actually give us? Well, onChange, like any other event handler, of course, gives us that E, that event. So what we can actually do here is, because it's going to give us a event and it's going to give us some information inside of it, mainly it's going to give us what current text is in the text box. So if we use an arrow function here, just like you would if you were calling a function with a parameter, we can get the E because this is a callback. And then what we can do is we can set post title. And of course, because there's parentheses on here, we have to use this arrow function syntax. But luckily, we need it because we need that event anyway. Now, how do you get the current text in the text field from the event? Of course, if you're familiar with JavaScript, you will know that this is through E, the target on that object, and then the value. E.target.value. Now, that's looking good. So how can we actually test this? Well, first of all, let's just go ahead and comment out this line because we're not just ready for it yet. And let's go ahead and just output the value of the input just into some paragraph text here. So let's just put post title into some paragraph text. And this should actually, well, it's state. So this variable here should just listen to the state changes. So let's go back into here and let's start typing. And there you go, look at that. What it's doing is it's actually listening to changes in the text box and then updating that paragraph as we're going. So you can now see that whatever you've typed into this text box is stored up to date in post title, which now makes it really easy because now we can start generating our new posts array. So let's go ahead and remove that and uncomment these 2 lines and pop in our title. So our title is going to be post title. Now, our last issue here, posts and set posts. We're in a sub-component here, so we don't have access to this getter and setter for a piece of state in the parent. So where do we get it from? Well, what we're going to have to do is we're going to pass it through as props. So that's right, you can actually send a function through as a prop, which can actually make it which is actually really useful, especially if you're trying to pass through a getter and setter. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's go to let's go to app.js and let's pass in 2 props here. The first one is going to be posts. We want to send through that posts state as a prop called posts, and we can set posts, and we can just send the function. And if we send the function, what we can do there is we can run the function and it will actually run it here, which is really cool. It's almost like a reverse prop. So if we send over a function, whenever that function is run, it will actually affect the function in the parent, which is really cool. So let's see that in action. Of course, we'll need to get props, and then both of these calls here will have to be props dot. So they're getting off the props object. Simple as that. So let's go ahead and test it. Let's type in my new post, add post, and there we go. Look at that. It's added a new post. Let's add another one. As simple as that. Now we have a little issue here. Of course, we've added 2 new items to the array with the key of 999 here. So this should be something unique. You could just generate a random number here, but I'm not going to worry about that one too much. So there we go. That is how you work with form inputs in React. Alright, congratulations for making it this far through the tutorial. I hope you found it useful. But our application is pretty much done here. So we've made a basic sort of blog, I guess, where you've got a list of posts coming from an API, and you can add a new post. You can sort of log in to change the state here. Just some cool little things. I'm just going to do a couple of little things to this, just to show about other parts of React and how some of the modern JavaScript features from ES6 integrate with this. So the main thing here is going to be a loading whenever the posts are coming in from the API. So this is going to use something called conditional rendering. So essentially here, what we're going to have is when we have our lists of posts down here, at one point that list is going to be empty. In JavaScript, you have a statement that looks like this. A true or false value, let's say it's true, and then you can do a question mark, and then you can write what happens if it's true here. Value is true, and then a colon, and then value is false. So this is a conditional expression here, and we can use this sort of one-line conditional to actually conditionally render things onto the screen. And this sort of argument over here can actually just look at the value of state. So for example, if we have our posts here, and we're obviously already in curly brackets here, what we could do is we could evaluate whether the posts.length is either true or false. So if the post.length is 0, that's false, and if it's more than 0, then it's going to be true. So if we say post.length question mark, so that means if it's got a length, then display posts, which we've done. But then if at the end of this, if we put an otherwise, i.e. a colon, then we could say something like loading. And there we go. That's how you do conditional rendering. If we were to refresh the page, you would see loading there for a split second. And that's conditional rendering. Okay, thanks so much for watching. It's been really fun teaching this. Now I implore you to go and practice. I really struggled learning React until I'd really tried applying it to my own project. So for example, I wanted to build a portfolio, and it really wasn't until I actually got started and built that portfolio until I actually understood React at all. I just thought I understood it by watching tutorials. This tutorial has tried to address all the things that I found difficult learning, so all the things that confuse me in tutorials. I've tried to make it as clear as possible here. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.